So we've got two readings this morning. And I'm not a big fan of trigger warnings necessarily, but these are fairly intense. They're short, but fairly intense, especially the second one, and particularly for young ears. The first one is an excerpt from the UUA Statement of Conscience. And I encourage you to read that entire document if you haven't already. It says, "Our faith calls us to create peace. Yet we confess that we have not done all we could to prevent the spread of armed conflict throughout the world. At times, we have lacked the courage to speak and act against violence and injustice. At times, we have lacked the creativity to speak and act in constructive ways. At times, we have condemned the violence of others without acknowledging our own complicity in violence." The second reading has come to be known as the Greenberg Dictum from Rabbi Irving Greenberg's 1974 essay called "Cloud of Smoke, Pillar of Fire." This passage reads, "The cruelty and the killing raise the question whether even those who believe after such an event dare talk about God, who loves and cares without making a mockery of those who suffered. The nemesis of denial is culpability. Woe to those so at ease that they feel no guilt or tension. Often this is the sign of the death of the soul. Let us offer then as a working principle the following. No statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. So you've likely heard me talking about these Huts for Vets trips that I get to do each summer. All the participants on those trips are remarkable, but last season I had the pleasure of meeting someone who was not only remarkable, but remarkably interesting, and you'll see why. Reverend Chris Antal was a UU Army chaplain for several years until he resigned in April of 2016 as an act of protest to the US policies regarding armed drones and nuclear weapons. This resignation followed a sermon that he delivered while stationed in Kandahar, Afghanistan. He is currently a UU chaplain at the VA Center of Philadelphia, where he co-facilitates a group that addresses moral injury in uniquely effective ways. He is a staunch and steadfast advocate for UU principles in the face of tremendous pressures to be otherwise. Please welcome Reverend Chris Antal.
This morning, I will be abiding by the Greenberg Dictum. After Fox died in Our Time for All Ages, the animals sat in silence for a very long time. We can learn from the animals in this regard. After I returned from Afghanistan in 2013, I went to the mountains and sat in silence for 7 days in a monastery. It was still not enough time. The essay Rabbi Greenberg wrote is called "Cloud of Smoke, Pillar of Fire." So I have my pillar of fire, and this will be a cloud of smoke. I'm going to address the role of the church on Memorial Day, and simply put, the role of the church, of the faith community, of the congregation, the sanctuary, the mosque, the religious community I'm speaking to, is to remember well. Remember well. And I'm going to unpack what that means, what they could mean to remember well. But first, let's do this. Let's acknowledge the day and the moment. And let me invite the community to respond by moving your body. If you're remembering a person or people this morning, this is a focused invitation, who has died in US wars during military service. Please rise as you're willing and able in body or in spirit. You can stand, you can raise your arms. If you'd like to give voice to the name of that person or those people, now I invite you to speak those names aloud. If you're on Zoom, you could put them into the chat. Maybe someone can read them. Let's expand the invitation a little more, acknowledging that there are wounds that people suffer after war that lead also to death as a consequence of their experience in war and military service. So if you are remembering this morning, perhaps a US military veteran who has died in the afterwar due to a service-connected condition, an accidental injury, overdose, suicide, cancer because of exposure to toxins. If you're remembering one of those people this morning, please rise in whatever way works for you. And if you feel so moved, I invite you to give voice to that name or those names. At ease, as you can relax, sit. It's one role of the church on a national holiday like Memorial Day to remember these people who died during and after service in the US military. We may call this the pastoral role, the pastoral task, to acknowledge these deaths, provide grief support to survivors, comfort the afflicted. This is one role, and a significant one at that. But if we stop there, we only remember selectively. And to remember well, we need to move towards deep remembering. And here I'm taught by a German theologian who's done a lot of work reflecting on his own complicity as part of the German people in their relationship to the Holocaust. And it's Geico Müller-Fahrenholz, and he has a chapter in this book called Toward Deep Remembering, and he clarifies for us the difference between selective remembering and deep remembering. Selective remembering, he says, is a way of rereading history that looks at national victories without counting the damage done to others, without contemplating the guilt involved. Selective remembering produces ideologies of denial and suppression, needs to demonize the other in order to preserve its own purity and sense of mission. It leads to cultures of revenge and policies of retaliation. He contrasts this with what he calls deep remembering. Grateful, and I quote, for genuine greatness, but does not shun guilt and suppression, rejoices in human inventiveness and ingenuity, but also shares in the many forms of suffering. Deep remembering transforms the art of the possible. Deep remembering for a religious community involves the work of theological reflection. And we did a little bit of that this morning, engaging with the Creating Peace statement of conscience. Theological reflection is the work of grounding ourselves in our sources, our principles and purposes, our scripture, our tradition, in order to remember who we are. in order that we may not lose sight of that. 4 questions can guide us in this process of theological reflection, and I offer them for contemplation. The first is the descriptive task. What's going on? What has been going on? What happened? The second is the interpretive task. Why is it going on? The third is the normative task. What ought to be going on? And this is where we look to our sources, our principles, our aspirational dreams. And finally, the fourth task is pragmatic. What do we do next? We have in our tradition, Unitarian Universalism, what Richard Gilbert has called the prophetic imperative. James Luther Adams called it the prophethood of all believers. Recently, Unitarian theologian Paul Razor has written a book called Reclaiming Prophetic Witness. So we have a pastoral role, but we also have a prophetic role. And to remember well, we need both. The prophetic role of a church, a congregation in the United States that calls itself religious on Memorial Day is to remember, to learn about, and reckon with the full cost of our wars and military service on people and the planet. Not just here within these United States, but everywhere, especially among the marginalized, the disenfranchised, and economically destitute, as your mission says at All Souls, in communities that are farthest from justice. Tribal regions of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and into the flames of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dresden, Tokyo, and Hiroshima. The prophetic task of our tradition, the Unitarian Universalist tradition, extends even further, for we are morally obligated through our covenantal commitment to affirm and promote principles like a responsible search for truth and meaning, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, and to embody statements of conscience like creating peace. We are morally obligated, I offer to you for your consideration on this Memorial Day, to 3 prophetic tasks. The first is to confront psychological processes that sabotage our own prophetic mission. Processes like denial and self-deception and mechanisms of moral disengagement. Albert Bandura has explained this well. Dehumanization, diffusion or displacement of responsibility, the use of euphemistic language or pseudo-moral justifications. We often see this in the campaign names of our military ventures. And at this point, I should say what I should have said at the beginning is that I do work for the Department of Veterans Affairs. I am a federal employee, but in the context of this message, I do not speak on behalf of the US government, and what I say is not representative of the Department of Veterans Affairs. I speak to you from the heart of a Unitarian clergyman to a congregation within my tradition. So the first task is to confront these psychological processes in ourselves, in others, and in the culture. The second is to move into who we are and who we are not, to examine and differentiate ourselves from the cultures and the structures we inhabit. I did this work myself as a Unitarian Universalist clergyman serving as an Army chaplain in Afghanistan, wearing Army fatigues, an officer, a soldier, but also an ordained clergyman who has been endorsed and sent by my denomination into the institution of the military to represent all that we are. And I took that role very seriously. So we have to examine and differentiate ourselves from structural violence, cultural violence, what the peace educator Johann Galtung calls the triangle of violence that we are often immersed in, but so concealed we can't often see it. It's the structural violence and the cultural violence that feeds into and emboldens the direct violence that manifests in military force and armed conflict. So what are these elements of structural and cultural violence in the United States? Andrew Bacevich, military historian, calls the new American militarism. My colleague Kelly Denton Borhaug speaks of US war culture, the interpenetration of all elements of our society, popular culture, academia, corporations, on and on and on, with the idea of war and violence. This culture in the United States includes elements of what Robert Bellah called American civil religion. It has a theological dimension. More recently, Jeremy Gunn named it as American national religion, the unholy trinity of a commitment to governmental theism, military supremacy, and an understanding of capitalism as freedom. This is what he calls the American national religion. And if we're not vigilant, this cultural religion will seep into the walls of our congregations. It will inform and shape our own theologies in ways that are not helpful, but quite harmful. Walter Wink calls this the theology of redemptive violence. This is the idea that violence deployed by good people will save us from violence in the hands of bad people. Paul Razor wrote about this eloquently in his book. The theology of violence gives divine sanction to military power used in the service of national and imperial policies. I quote Paul Razor. This ideology is pervasive, often concealed, unexamined in our society, especially around nationalistic holidays like Memorial Day and Veterans Day. If we're not careful, we will lose ourselves. The church will fail in our prophetic task and be nothing more than a collaborator, an enabler, complicit, sanctifying war culture, concealing US violence in a cloak of piety. The third prophetic task of the church is to invite us to live in the presence of burning children. Rabbi Greenberg warned us in our reading, woe to those so at ease they feel no guilt or tension. Often this is a sign of the death of the soul. Living in the presence of burning children means accepting appropriate guilt and tension to maintain a sense of empathic unsettlement, a term I learned from Dominic LeCapra, empathic unsettlement. To acknowledge and accept that war and military force is often traumatizing and often produces atrocity and devastation and horror, and we may wish to avoid facing these horrors. And what could be more horrific than burning children? Yet, at times, we may need to turn away, but eventually have a moral obligation to return, to witness to these and other traumas, to face the consequences of our collective decision-making, our human world building. Joshua Peterson put it well when he said, we witness to trauma to help with healing, but we also witness to learn, to remember, to warn, and to prevent. When the church accepts this prophetic imperative to be a moral witness and to reclaim prophetic witness, we will avert the soul death and ensure all souls thrive. In September of 2012, I purchased a copy of John Turman's book called The Death of Others, The Fate of Civilians, and America's Wars. I read it on my flight to Afghanistan. It shook me to the core. It motivated me to preach that sermon I gave in November of 2012, a Veterans Day Confession for America. It may have been fiery. The Army didn't feel the love. I was investigated, reprimanded, and released from active duty with a General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand for politically inflammatory speech. But what that book taught me is to face the reality of hellfire. Yes, hellfire. You've heard it been said that ours is the no hell church. Our universal affirmation of God's love leave no place for the discussion of hellfire. This morning, I'm going to break with that tradition. You see, I believe in hellfire. I've seen it. And this morning, I want to talk about it. It's not something that comes from below. I'm not talking about what's in the book of Revelation, the fire and sulfur, or Matthew's blazing furnace, or Peter's chains of darkness. I'm not talking about any place or state of punishment and privation of human souls after death. This hellfire comes from the sky, not below us. And those who live in fear of it often fear the blue skies themselves. It's not supernatural, it's quite scientific. Originally, the missile was designated Hellfire with one L, Heliborne Laser Fire and Forget. The Army later adopted Hellfire as the official name and added an L. They're assembled now in a facility in Orlando, Florida by Northrop Grumman, a corporation on the S&P 500. They're about to pay out dividends. They're doing well. One Hellfire missile sells to the US government for $150,000. The Department of Defense bought over 71,000 in the last 2 decades and recently contracted for another $650 million. They've been used to kill people all over the world, including Afghanistan, where the per budget capita annual income is $390. The US spends more on one Hellfire missile than the average Afghan will earn in 6 lifetimes or 385 years. We'll never know exactly how many people in the US has burned with this Hellfire or other missiles. In the Air Force's own strategic bombery summaries, they acknowledge dropping 326,000 bombs in the past 2 decades since September 11th, an average of 46 bombs a day. Many of the Hellfires aren't even counted in this number. This kind of Hellfire that came from the sky over Kabul, Afghanistan on the 29th of August, 2021, killed Malika and Samaya and 5 other children. Malika and Samaya are 2 years old. 3 other adults died as well. 10 people were killed in what was the final US military act of the Afghan war. A drone strike, a Hellfire missile, 7 children, 10 people dead. As we stand together against forgetting, deeply remembering, we could remember other children burned in military campaigns, the genocidal raids against the indigenous people, the incendiary carpet bombings of Dresden and Tokyo, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Ryuko Watanabe was 12 when she was incinerated in Hiroshima. Her surviving relatives could only recover a scorched lunchbox. The napalm that set 8-year-old Kim Phuc Phan Thai's body on fire in Vietnam in 1972 and was captured in a photograph, Napalm Girl. set her body ablaze. She wrote about it later. She survived it. And in her memoir called Fire Road, she described it as the fiercest adversary a human being could ever meet, napalm on the body. She was a burning child who'd survived. And now she's thriving. This morning, I will give the honorarium that is offered to me for this message to her foundation. She's in Canada. Her foundation helps children who've been injured in armed conflict. I would encourage you to read her book, Fire Road, and to support her foundation. You've heard it said that there is no hellfire. A loving God will spare us from the flames and burns, but I say to you, there is another truth. All souls do not escape the burn of hellfire. Those whom our bombs and missiles destroy are burned in body, and we who carefully examine the evidence and our own conscience, among them many veterans that I work with in our moral injury program, they live in the presence of burning children, the ones who called in the missiles, who loaded the missiles, who searched through the remains and found smoldering children. We who carefully examine the evidence in our conscience and find ourselves complicit are burned in soul. I count myself among them. And I say, in the presence of burning children, so too should our consciences be burning. And as we do church on Memorial Day and move towards deep remembering, we do it in the presence of burning children. Our chalice, a sign for our burning conscience. And so we remember them, share responsibility for their deaths, so we may harness the power to create a better world where people no longer burn in the hellfire of our own creation. Thank you.